Sarah Martinez sat alone at the corner table of Murphy's bar, nursing a glass of water while watching the crowd around her. The dimly lit establishment was packed with off-duty military personnel from the nearby base, their voices rising and falling in animated conversations about training exercises and weekend plans. She had chosen this spot deliberately, keeping her back to the wall and maintaining a clear view of both exits. At 28, Sarah possessed an unassuming appearance that served her well in her line of work. Standing 5 feet 6 inches with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, she wore civilian clothes that concealed the lean, powerful physique beneath. Her dark eyes moved constantly, cataloging faces, noting body language, and assessing potential threats with the practiced ease of someone trained to survive in hostile environments. The bar buzzed with typical Friday night energy. Groups of soldiers clustered around high-top tables, sharing stories and decompressing from another week of rigorous training. The jukebox played classic rock, while bartenders worked efficiently to keep drinks flowing. Sarah had been observing the establishment for 30 minutes, part of her ongoing mission to gather intelligence on potential security vulnerabilities at military gathering places. What she hadn't anticipated was becoming the center of unwanted attention herself. A group of 6 Marines had noticed her sitting alone and were now making their way across the crowded floor toward her table. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Young, confident, and looking for entertainment after a long week of training. Their swagger and loud voices suggested they had already consumed several drinks before spotting her. The leader of the group was a tall, broad-shouldered man with closely cropped blonde hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge. His uniform displayed the rank of sergeant, and his companions clearly looked to him for direction. As they approached, Sarah could hear fragments of their conversation. "Look at her sitting all by herself," one of them said with a grin. "Maybe she needs some company. Probably waiting for someone who's not going to show," another added. "We should go cheer her up." Sarah remained motionless, her expression neutral, as she continued to observe their approach. Her training had taught her to remain calm in potentially volatile situations, to assess threats without betraying any sign of concern or preparation. To the casual observer, she appeared to be simply a young woman enjoying a quiet drink alone. The Marines reached her table, arranging themselves in a loose semicircle that effectively blocked her access to the nearest exit. The sergeant leaned against her table with practiced casualness, his smile confident and expectant. "Evening, miss," he said in a voice loud enough to carry over the bar's ambient noise. "I'm Sergeant Mike Thompson, and these are my boys. We couldn't help but notice you sitting here all alone. Mind if we join you?" Sarah looked up at him with polite disinterest. "Actually, I prefer the quiet." "Thanks anyway." Thompson's smile widened, but there was something less friendly in his eyes now. "Come on, don't be like that. We're just being neighborly. This is a military bar after all. What brings a civilian like you to a place like this?" The assumption that she was a civilian was exactly what Sarah had hoped for when choosing her outfit for the evening. Her cover identity for this particular assignment involved posing as a local college student conducting research on military culture for a sociology project. The story was simple enough to be believable, while giving her a legitimate reason to frequent establishments popular with service members. "I'm actually working on a research project," she replied, keeping her voice level and unassuming. "Just observing social dynamics in different environments." One of the other Marines, a stocky man with red hair, laughed loudly. "Social dynamics? That's a fancy way of saying people watching. Maybe we can give you something more interesting to observe." Sarah recognized the subtle shift in the group's energy. What had started as casual flirtation was beginning to take on a more aggressive edge. The Marines were feeding off each other's bravado, each trying to impress his companions while simultaneously asserting dominance over what they perceived as an easy target. "I appreciate the offer, but I really do prefer to work alone," Sarah said. Her tone remaining polite, but firm, she reached for her water glass, noting how the simple movement caused 2 of the Marines to shift their positions slightly, unconsciously preparing to block any attempt she might make to leave. Sergeant Thompson pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without invitation. "Look, sweetheart, we're not taking no for an answer here. My boys and I have had a rough week, and we're just looking for some friendly conversation. Surely you can spare a few minutes for the men who protect your freedom." Scene. The statement contained the implicit threat Sarah had been expecting. The assumption that she owed them her time and attention simply because of their military service, combined with their positioning around her table, represented a classic intimidation tactic. In her years of training and field experience, she had encountered similar situations countless times, though usually in foreign countries where the stakes were considerably higher. "I understand you've had a difficult week," Sarah replied, maintaining her cover persona while mentally cataloging each man's position and probable skill level. "But I'm sure there are plenty of other people here who would enjoy your company more than I would." The red-haired Marine leaned over the table, bringing his face closer to hers. "What's wrong with our company? You think you're too good for Marines? Maybe you're one of those anti-military types who comes to places like this just to look down on us." Sarah could smell alcohol on his breath and noted the slight flush to his cheeks that indicated he had consumed more than his companions. Intoxicated individuals were unpredictable and often more likely to escalate situations beyond the point where they could be resolved peacefully. "I have nothing against the military," she said truthfully. "I simply prefer to work alone, as I mentioned." Thompson stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You know what I think? I think you're being rude to American heroes who are just trying to be friendly. Maybe someone needs to teach you some manners." The threat was now explicit, and Sarah noted that their conversation had begun to attract attention from nearby tables. Some patrons were watching with interest, while others appeared uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. The bartender was busy at the far end of the bar and hadn't yet noticed the developing situation. Sarah remained seated, her posture relaxed despite the escalating tension. Her training had taught her that premature action often created more problems than it solved. Until the situation crossed certain clearly defined lines, her best option was to maintain her cover and attempt to de-escalate through verbal means. "I'm not trying to be rude," she said calmly. "I'm just not interested in socializing tonight. Surely you can understand that people sometimes want to be alone." One of the younger Marines, barely out of his teens by his appearance, spoke up for the first time. "Maybe she's waiting for her boyfriend. Probably some rich college boy who thinks he's better than us working guys." "Nah," Thompson replied, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I don't see any boyfriend. And if there was one, he should have known better than to leave a pretty girl alone in a place like this. Dangerous things can happen when women don't have proper protection." The implication was clear, and Sarah felt the familiar calm that always descended upon her when a situation moved beyond the realm of simple harassment into potential physical threat. Her body remained relaxed, but every muscle was now primed and ready to respond with lethal efficiency if necessary. "I can take care of myself," she said simply. Thompson laughed, and his companions joined in. "Sure you can, sweetheart. College girls are known for their tough street fighting skills. Tell you what. Why don't you prove it? Show us these self-defense moves they taught you in women's studies class." The group was now completely blocking her table, their body language becoming increasingly aggressive. Sarah noted that the youngest Marine seemed uncomfortable with the direction the encounter was taking, but peer pressure was keeping him silent. The others appeared fully committed to whatever course of action their sergeant decided upon. Sarah finished her water and set the glass down carefully on the table. "I think it's time for me to leave." "Not so fast," Thompson said, placing his hand on the table between her and the exit. "The night's still young, and we're just getting acquainted. Besides, we haven't finished our conversation about respect for the military." Sarah looked at each of the 6 men surrounding her table, memorizing faces and calculating angles of attack. Her cover story was holding, and they still believed her to be a helpless civilian college student. That misconception would be their greatest disadvantage if the situation deteriorated further. "What exactly do you want from me?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Thompson's smile was no longer even pretending to be friendly. "We want you to show us the appreciation that American fighting men deserve. And we want you to do it with a smile and some enthusiasm. Otherwise, things might get unpleasant for everyone involved." The bar around them continued its normal Friday night rhythm, most patrons unaware of the drama unfolding in the corner. Sarah knew that help was not coming from outside sources. Whatever happened next would depend entirely on her own actions and decisions. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and unthreatening. Gentlemen, I'm going to walk out of here now. I suggest you let me pass without incident. The Marines moved closer together, their formation tightening around her position. I don't think so, Thompson replied. You see, you've hurt our feelings with all this rejection. We're going to need some compensation for the emotional damage. 2-3. We've heard offer Ramba. Sarah's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward her purse, where certain items were concealed that would dramatically alter the balance of power in this confrontation. But she held back, still hoping that the situation might resolve itself without the need to break her carefully constructed cover. Last chance, she said quietly. Step aside and let me leave. The red-haired Marine moved to block her path more completely. Everyone here is military, and we take care of our own. No one's coming to help you now. Sarah looked at the 6 Marines surrounding her and made a decision that would change everything. The red-haired Marine who had just declared that no one was coming to help her was standing closest to her left side, his balance slightly off from the alcohol he had consumed. His positioning made him the logical first target if violence became necessary. You're absolutely right, Sarah said calmly, her voice carrying a different quality now. No one is coming to help me, which means I'll have to help myself. Before anyone could react to the subtle change in her tone, Sarah moved with fluid precision that seemed almost impossible for someone her size. Her left hand shot out in a lightning-fast strike to the red-haired Marine's throat, hitting precisely at the pressure point that would temporarily paralyze his vocal cords without causing permanent damage. As he stumbled backward, gasping for air, she pivoted on her right foot and drove her elbow into the solar plexus of the Marine standing behind her. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds, and suddenly 2 of the 6 men were on the ground, struggling to breathe and completely out of the fight. Sergeant Thompson stared in shock at his fallen companions, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. The quiet college student had moved like a trained fighter. Her strikes delivered with surgical precision and devastating effectiveness. But before he could fully comprehend the situation, Sarah was already engaging his remaining men. The youngest Marine, who had seemed reluctant to participate in the harassment, found himself facing Sarah as she turned toward the rest of the group. His training kicked in, and he threw a standard military punch aimed at her face. Sarah deflected it effortlessly with her forearm while simultaneously striking his wrist at the precise angle needed to temporarily disable his hand. As he cried out in pain, she followed up with a knee to his stomach that doubled him over and sent him crashing into a nearby table. The remaining 3 Marines finally began to react with the coordination their training had taught them. They spread out in a tactical formation, approaching Sarah from different angles to prevent her from focusing on one opponent at a time. These men were more experienced than their younger companion, and their movements showed the discipline of soldiers who had seen real combat. Sarah assessed the new threat level and adjusted her strategy accordingly. The confined space between tables actually worked to her advantage, limiting their ability to surround her completely while giving her multiple obstacles to use for cover and leverage. She grabbed a chair and hurled it at the Marine, approaching from her right, the heavy wooden furniture catching him in the chest and knocking him backward into other patrons. Thompson finally overcame his shock and lunged toward Sarah, his superior size and reach making him the most dangerous of the remaining opponents. But Sarah had been trained to fight men much larger than herself, and size became irrelevant when proper technique was applied to vulnerable targets. She ducked under his reaching arms and delivered a precise strike to his knee, hitting the pressure point that would cause his leg to buckle without inflicting permanent injury. As Thompson fell to one knee, Sarah spun to face the last standing Marine, a lean man with quick reflexes who had managed to get behind her during the chaos. He had drawn a small knife from his boot, apparently deciding that the situation required more serious measures. The appearance of the weapon changed the entire dynamic of the encounter, justifying a much more aggressive response from Sarah. "Big mistake," she said, her voice carrying an edge that would have warned any experienced fighter to reconsider their actions. The knife-wielding Marine made the classic error of telegraphing his attack, drawing back his arm in preparation for a stabbing motion that gave Sarah ample time to react. She stepped inside his reach, grabbed his wrist with both hands, and applied a joint lock that forced him to drop the weapon while simultaneously driving him to his knees. The technique was one she had practiced thousands of times in training, designed to neutralize armed opponents without killing them. The entire fight had lasted less than 30 seconds, and 6 trained Marines were now either unconscious, disabled, or writhing in pain on the floor around Sarah's table. She stood in the center of the carnage, breathing normally and showing no signs of exertion despite having just defeated half a dozen men in hand-to-hand combat. The bar had fallen completely silent. Every patron and staff member was staring at Sarah in stunned disbelief, trying to reconcile the mild-mannered young woman they had observed earlier with the devastating fighter they had just witnessed. Some people were reaching for their phones to call for help, while others seemed frozen in place by the sheer impossibility of what they had seen. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, knowing that her cover was now completely blown. There was no way to explain away what had just happened as lucky self-defense moves learned in a college martial arts class. Her training and capabilities had been displayed too clearly for any reasonable alternative explanation. Sergeant Thompson was still on the ground, clutching his injured knee and staring up at Sarah with a mixture of pain and dawning comprehension. "What the hell are you?" he gasped. Sarah considered her options. Her mission parameters had included maintaining her civilian cover at all costs, but that objective was now impossible to achieve. The situation required immediate damage control to prevent wider security implications from her exposure. "Someone you shouldn't have messed with," she replied, keeping her answer vague while she decided how much information to reveal. The red-haired Marine had recovered enough breath to speak, though his voice was hoarse from the throat strike. "You're military," he wheezed. "Nobody fights like that without serious training." Several other patrons had moved closer, their curiosity overcoming their caution as they realized the immediate danger had passed. Sarah could hear whispered conversations as people tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. Words like Special Forces and Black Ops drifted through the crowd, confirming her fear that speculation was already moving in dangerous directions. The bartender finally emerged from behind the bar, carrying a baseball bat and looking uncertain about how to handle the situation. "I've called the police," he announced. "Everyone just stay calm until they get here." Sarah knew she had perhaps 10 minutes before local law enforcement arrived, and their presence would create a whole new set of complications. Her mission handlers would need to be notified immediately, and extraction procedures would have to be implemented before her identity could be officially documented by civilian authorities. "That won't be necessary," she said, reaching into her purse to retrieve a leather wallet. She flipped it open to display credentials that caused the bartender's eyes to widen in recognition. "I'm going to need you to cancel that call and clear this area." The identification she had shown was not her Navy SEAL credentials, but rather a cover identity that carried sufficient authority to commandeer civilian situations when necessary. The bartender stared at the badge and official seal, his expression shifting from confusion to nervous compliance. "Yes, ma'am," he said, reaching for his phone to call back the police dispatcher. "I'll tell them it was a false alarm." Sarah turned back to the Marines on the ground, most of whom were beginning to recover from their initial shock and injuries. They were looking at her with new understanding, recognizing that they had encountered someone far outside their normal experience. "Let me guess," Thompson said, his voice strained but functional. "CIA? NSA? Or something even more classified?" Sarah knelt down beside him, speaking in a voice low enough that only he could hear. "What I am is not your concern. What should concern you is that this incident never happened. You and your men were involved in a bar fight with some local civilians who left before the authorities arrived. You slipped and injured your knee during the altercation. Your friends had too much to drink and fell down. End of story." Thompson studied her face, seeing something in her expression that convinced him she was not making a request. "And if we don't stick to that story, then you'll discover that there are consequences for interfering with ongoing national security operations," Sarah replied. "Consequences that would make tonight's experience seem like a pleasant memory." The youngest Marine, who had been helped to his feet by other patrons, overheard part of the conversation. "We're sorry, ma'am," he said quickly. "We didn't know. We thought you were just a helpless civilian," Sarah finished. "Which is exactly what you were supposed to think. The fact that you're apologizing suggests you're smarter than your friends. Remember that intelligence if you want to have a long and successful military career." She stood up and looked around the bar, noting that most of the other patrons were still watching her with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Her presence was now a liability to the establishment and to her own mission objectives. The sooner she could disappear, the better for everyone involved. "Listen carefully," she said to the room in general, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "What you witnessed tonight was a training exercise. These Marines volunteered to participate in a demonstration of advanced defensive techniques. Anyone who discusses this event outside these walls will be investigated for potential security violations." The explanation was obviously fabricated, but it provided people with a story they could tell themselves that made sense of an otherwise inexplicable situation. Most civilians preferred believable lies to uncomfortable truths when it came to government operations they weren't supposed to know about. Sarah walked toward the exit, her path clear as other patrons stepped aside to let her pass. At the door, she paused and looked back at the Marines, who were helping each other to their feet with the assistance of other bar patrons. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now quiet establishment, "next time you decide to corner a woman who's sitting alone, you might want to consider the possibility that she chose to sit alone for a very good reason." Sarah stepped out into the cool night air, leaving Murphy's bar behind her as she walked briskly toward the parking lot where her rental car waited. The adrenaline from the confrontation was already fading, replaced by the methodical thinking that had kept her alive through countless dangerous situations around the world. Her cover was blown, her mission was compromised, and now she needed to implement damage control procedures that would minimize the fallout from the evening's events. She reached into her jacket pocket and activated an encrypted communication device, establishing contact with her handler at Naval Special Warfare Command. The call would be routed through multiple secure relays before reaching its destination, making it virtually impossible to intercept or trace. "Raven here," she said, using her operational call sign as she unlocked her car and slipped into the driver's seat. "I need immediate extraction. Cover is blown, mission compromised. 6 witnesses, all military. Situation contained, but requires cleanup." The voice that responded was calm and professional, betraying no surprise at the unexpected contact. "Understood, Raven. What's your current status?" "Mobile and uninjured. Opposition neutralized without permanent damage. Local authorities were contacted but called off. Civilian witnesses, given cover story. Military witnesses require official handling." Sarah started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, automatically checking her mirrors for any signs of pursuit. Her training made such precautions second nature, even in situations where danger was unlikely. The empty streets of the small military town stretched before her as she drove toward the predetermined extraction point. "Extraction team is being mobilized," her handler informed her. "Etta, 23 minutes. Proceed to backup location Charlie and await contact. Cleanup crew is being dispatched to handle witness management." Sarah acknowledged the instructions and ended the call, her mind already shifting focus to the next phase of the operation. Within hours, the incident at Murphy's bar would be officially documented as a training exercise. The Marines involved would be transferred to new assignments far from the area, and all records of her presence in the town would be systematically erased from every database and surveillance system. As she drove through the quiet streets, Sarah reflected on the events that had led to this moment. 3 months earlier, she had been selected for a deep cover assignment, investigating potential security breaches at military installations across the country. Intelligence agencies had identified patterns suggesting that foreign operatives were targeting off-duty service members in social settings, gathering information about base operations through seemingly casual conversations in bars and clubs. Her mission had been to pose as a civilian researcher, frequenting military establishments to observe and document security vulnerabilities while gathering intelligence on suspicious individuals. The assignment had required her to suppress her natural fighting instincts and maintain the persona of a harmless academic, even when faced with situations that would normally trigger an immediate tactical response. The confrontation with the Marines had forced her to abandon that carefully constructed identity, revealing capabilities that took years to develop and millions of dollars in training to perfect. Sarah was one of only a handful of female operatives to complete Navy SEAL training, having endured the same brutal physical and mental challenges that had broken thousands of male candidates. Her success rate on classified missions was unprecedented, making her one of the most valuable assets in the entire special operations community. But tonight, 6 drunk Marines had managed to accomplish what enemy agents and terrorist organizations had failed to achieve in 5 years of active duty. They had compromised her cover and exposed her true nature to witnesses who would remember what they had seen for the rest of their lives. Sarah reached the extraction point, a deserted warehouse complex on the outskirts of town, and parked her vehicle in the designated location. She retrieved a small device from her purse and activated it, sending a signal that would guide the incoming extraction team to her precise position. The device also contained a thermite charge that would completely destroy her rental car and any evidence it might contain once she was safely away from the area. While waiting for her ride, Sarah used the time to complete her mission report, documenting every detail of the evening's events for analysis by her superiors. The incident would be studied extensively, not as a failure but as valuable intelligence about the challenges facing deep cover operatives in domestic assignments. Her experience would help refine training procedures and operational protocols for future missions. 20 minutes later, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the warehouse complex and flashed its headlights in the agreed-upon pattern. Sarah approached the vehicle, verified the identity of its occupants through the window, and climbed into the back seat. As they drove away, she pressed a button on her device, triggering the destruction of her rental car in a brief but intense flash of white-hot flame. The driver of the SUV was a fellow SEAL whom Sarah had served with on previous operations. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Heard you had some excitement tonight," he said. 6 Marines, really?" Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. "They escalated the situation beyond what I could control through verbal de-escalation. Physical force became necessary to prevent further escalation that could have resulted in serious injuries. To them or to you? To them. I was never in any real danger." Her teammate chuckled. "I imagine they figured that out pretty quickly. What was their reaction when they realized what they'd gotten themselves into?" "Shock, followed by fear, followed by respect. Standard progression when civilians encounter special operations personnel in an uncontrolled environment." The SUV turned onto a highway leading toward a military airfield, where a transport aircraft waited to return Sarah to her home base. Within hours, she would be debriefing with senior officers and planning her next assignment. The incident at Murphy's Bar would become a classified footnote in her service record, known only to a handful of people with the highest security clearances. As they drove through the night, Sarah thought about the Marines she had left behind at the bar. By now, they would be receiving visits from military intelligence officers who would explain the national security implications of what they had witnessed. They would be offered new assignments in distant locations, along with strong suggestions that they forget everything that had happened that evening. The youngest Marine, who had shown reluctance to participate in the harassment, would likely be approached for recruitment into special operations training. His quick apology and immediate understanding of the situation suggested the kind of adaptability and intelligence that made for successful covert operatives. Sarah made a mental note to recommend him for consideration when she filed her final report. Sergeant Thompson and his more aggressive companions would find their military careers stalled at their current ranks, their security clearances frozen pending extensive background investigations. They would never know exactly why their advancement opportunities had suddenly disappeared, but the message would be clear enough for anyone with sufficient intelligence to understand it. The red-haired Marine who had declared that no one was coming to help her would spend the rest of his career remembering the lesson he had learned that night. Help had indeed come, but not in the form he had expected. It had come from within Sarah herself, from years of training that had transformed her into one of the most lethal fighters on the planet. As the SUV approached the airfield, Sarah could see the dark silhouette of the waiting aircraft against the star-filled sky. In a few hours, she would be back in her real world, surrounded by fellow warriors who understood the sacrifices and responsibilities that came with their unusual profession. The role of helpless college student would be discarded like a worn costume, replaced by the black uniform and insignia that marked her as one of America's elite defenders. But the memory of the evening would remain with her, adding another layer to the complex psychological armor that protected operatives like her from the emotional toll of their work. She had been forced to break cover to protect herself, but in doing so, she had also protected the illusion that allowed thousands of other operatives to work undetected in civilian environments around the world. The Marines at Murphy's Bar would tell their story, but it would be dismissed as alcohol-fueled exaggeration by anyone who heard it. The idea that a quiet college student could single-handedly defeat 6 trained fighters was simply too far-fetched for most people to believe. The truth would be hidden in plain sight, protected by its own impossibility. Sarah smiled as the SUV pulled through the gates of the military airfield. Tomorrow, there would be new missions and new covers to maintain. But tonight, 6 Marines had learned a valuable lesson about making assumptions based on appearances. In her world, nothing was ever quite what it seemed, and the most dangerous people were often the ones who looked the least threatening. The aircraft engines were already warming up as Sarah boarded, leaving behind the small town and its military bar, where an evening of routine surveillance had become a masterclass in the unpredictable nature of covert operations. She settled into her seat for the flight home, already planning the modifications to training procedures that would help future operatives avoid similar compromises. But deep down, she knew that sometimes exposure was unavoidable. Sometimes, the cover had to be blown to protect something more important, and sometimes, showing the enemy exactly who they were dealing with was the most effective deterrent of all. The Marines had asked what she was, and she had given them the only answer that mattered. She was someone they shouldn't have messed with. Someone trained to handle whatever threats emerged from the darkness. Someone who would always be ready when others needed help, even if they never knew she was there. The aircraft lifted off into the night sky, carrying Sarah away from Murphy's Bar and toward her next assignment in the endless war fought by shadows against shadows. Behind her, 6 Marines would spend the rest of their lives knowing they had encountered something extraordinary, something that existed beyond their understanding but defended their way of life every single day. And in bars and clubs around the world, other quiet observers would continue their watch, protected by the lesson those Marines had learned the hard way. Sometimes, the person sitting alone in the corner isn't waiting for help to arrive. Sometimes, she is the help that others are waiting for.